Okay, well, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Heromakers Podcast. And we are in the middle of November, getting near Thanksgiving now. So not Canadian Thanksgiving, because you already had that. But
yeah,
now
we did.
We're like a month behind you. Like I feel like we're kind of lagging behind you in so many ways. But I'm excited because Thanksgiving equals Christmas decorations equals lights outside equals joy to my life. So but it's crazy, and this year, because in one of our recent episodes we talked about you being back to phase one. Are you in phase one?
Yeah.
With the quarantine, and we're back in phase two. So right now we're trying to even decide what we're going to do for Thanksgiving. So
oh no, sorry.
But
Thanksgiving was canceled in Toronto.
That's not crazy. You can't really cancel a holiday. But festivities were canceled, right? In your heart, you were still celebrating.
Yeah, we couldn't gather in homes.
Yeah, at all.
Unless it was you're bubbled. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that doesn't happen to you guys.
Well, who even knows? But yeah, I figure this is why we have Zoom. So Ann, I'm very excited about our episode today because we're going to be talking about an issue we haven't yet talked about, which is immigration, refugees, and kind of loving those who are in transitional periods and that kind of good stuff. And so, and I am a big fan of World Relief and some of the work that they're doing. And so, and this is also a very timely topic with kind of the transition of power here in the U.S. and all of that. So, so we want to welcome Julie Schwietert Collazo. Did I say that right, Julie?
Sure, it's fine. Julie Schwietert Collazo. I've lived with that name for so long that I'm so used to any pronunciation. It's okay.
Okay, so we're just gonna call you Julie. And Julie, you founded this remarkable organization called Immigrant Families Together, and I was trying to remember where I first learned about the organization, and I can't honestly. It was more than a year ago, but your work has always stuck with me, and so I knew that we had to have you on the Heromakers podcast because what you're doing is just so representative of the potential that I think a lot of people have to see a need, and even if it's a really seemingly large need, and to push into that and then see lives change as a result. And so Immigrant Families Together, you kind of work to reunite families who have come here, and then you also work with families who are in some of the detention centers. But we'll let you get into that. But welcome to the podcast, Julie.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own journey, maybe even before you founded this? What was your life like, and a little bit about your family?
Sure. So in a strange way, Immigrant Families Together has brought me full circle professionally. I started my professional life as a social worker and worked at Housing Works, which is a radical social service agency here in New York that provides services to people with HIV, and many of the clients in their population are actually or formerly homeless and have histories of drug use, histories of incarceration. So that was my first job upon graduating from college. And while working there, I started my master's degree in social work, and then ended up becoming, at a really young age, the assistant director of a day treatment program for adults with mental illnesses here in New York. Mm-hmm. And quickly burned out on that, not because of the work with the clients, but because of the bureaucracy of nonprofits, which is a very ironic point that we will come back to. And so I left the field, and I was really disillusioned. I was really disillusioned, particularly because I felt like, everybody had always said, okay, if you want to make a change, you have to make it from the inside, right? And I thought, oh, well, I'm in a management position and I can't make any change. So, where is the place for me in this profession? And I think because I had always really been kind of a high achieving student, and I really thought this is what I was going to do with my life, when I left the field, I was really kind of unmoored and not sure what I was going to do. And so, of course, I made a very impulsive decision to move to Puerto Rico with Francisco, who would become my husband. And it was not difficult to convince him to do that because it was February in New York and our lease was coming up for renewal and it was really cold. And I said, why don't we move to Puerto Rico? And he said, sure, I'm from Cuba. That sounds good. We're neighbors. Let's go. So we moved there and I became a tour guide for Smithsonian, which I think people often hear my sort of overall career trajectory and they're like, how do all of these things fit together? And I think I would say that it's really all about telling other people's stories and helping sort of connect narrative dots for people so that they become passionate about and interested in people and places that may not be familiar to them, and so that they begin to understand them. So I did that for a few years. And then while I was there, also became a travel writer and journalist. And then from Puerto Rico, we moved to Mexico City for 2.5 years, and then came back to New York in 2009. And I just continued doing journalism work that entire time until the summer of 2018, when the Trump administration implemented this family separation policy. I think as a mother, as the wife of a refugee, as a former social worker, I was really looking at this from the perspective of a social systems interventions, right? So like everybody was saying, oh my gosh, what can we do? What can we do? But I really wanted to actually know how to answer that question and to do that in an effective way, right? As opposed to a way that was just sort of gestural or in a way that was maybe actually complicating things or making things more harmful. And so that's how I came back to social work again.
Okay, so so I'd like for you to tell us the story of the Guatemalan woman who kind of launched your organization. But it sounds like, Julie, that you were like already thinking of like helping these families. So was it kind of a cart and horse thing, right? So you were already kind of at that place when you heard about Yeti, the woman from Guatemala? Were you already kind of primed and the foundation was already built to jump into that?
Sort of. I mean, I think everybody who is a sentient being in the United States was waking up most days and wondering, oh my gosh, like how can we let this happen, right? But I think for a lot of folks, it really was an abstract question that didn't necessarily have an answer. And I think what I was really waking up for is like, I wanted to push past that abstraction and get to an answer. And I was just trying to figure out what's the point at which I want to intervene? Where would it be most useful? And so the answer for me came when on June 21st, 2018, I was listening to our local NPR station, and a New York City attorney, Jose Orochena, was talking about his client, Jenny Gonzalez Garcia. And she is a mom from Guatemala who had come here with her 3 children, and they were separated at the border. She was detained at Eloy Detention Center in Arizona, and her 3 children were sent to a foster care facility in New York. And what he said in the interview really struck me immediately as being the answer to the what do I do question. And what he said was, you know, this woman doesn't have to be in detention. She doesn't have to be separated from her kids. She's lucky in the sense that she knows where her kids are, whereas many parents didn't, and as we know now, still don't. But she knows where her kids are. She can be with them, and she can go through her asylum proceedings free. The only problem is that she needs to be able to pay a bond, right? Which is basically bail money that's paid to Immigration and Customs Enforcement to be released. And then she needs to be able to get from Arizona to New York. And as I heard him talk, sort of a couple of things came to mind simultaneously. One was, really, that's it? Like, it's that easy? You know, like, I'm by no means wealthy, but I really believed that between my husband and I, we had enough friends who were angry about this policy that collectively we would be able to raise some kind of money. I had no idea that it would be the amount of money that we've ended up raising. And I had no idea it would involve many, many more people. I was really thinking initially about this one mom and her kids. But I figured we could I think, mobilized enough people to get the bond money, although we didn't know at that time how much it was. And I think we can get her from Arizona to New York. And I think we can even do one better than that, because very early on, and it's precisely because of my background in social work, I understood it's not going to just be about getting out and getting here, right? It's going to be about being able to navigate this place that's wholly different from anything that you've ever lived in or known as you're trying to go through your asylum proceedings. And so to the extent that she and her family wanted us to be involved in their lives, that we would be their actual support system, their literal support system in New York City. And that could involve everything from providing housing. We had a friend here who provided her with a basement apartment as she was waiting to be reunited with her kids, rent-free. And so things like that, right? That we could chip in and sort of help make things easier and accompany her to court appointments and things like that. And so that's really how this began. It was this goal of posting bond for this one woman and getting her back with her kids.
So Julie, really quick, what does that look like when you, like, did you just call up the detention center and say, hey, I'm just this person from New York who wants to help this woman? Like, how did that initial conversation, what did it look like?
So the very first thing I did was I talked to my husband about it first, and I said, I heard this guy on the radio today, like, this is, something that I think that we can do, because we had both been having these conversations about what can we do? And he also comes from a social services background. And so when I told him that I had heard this attorney on the radio, and I said, this is what I'm thinking, like, what do you think? And when he came to the United States, he lived with a sponsor family who provided him with that level of support that I was talking about. And he said, I feel like this is a way for me to sort of pay that back in a way, right? To like honor what was given to me now that we have the means to do that, to be able to provide that to somebody else. So he was completely all in on it. And I had waited until that was a Thursday night. I waited until the following Monday to call the attorney. I just Googled him. He answered on the first ring. And I said, hey, I heard you on the radio. This is what I'm thinking. Like, what do you think? And he just started laughing hysterically. He said, of course I would be interested. Of course she would be interested. Like, how is she going to come up with this bond money otherwise? And so I said, would she be okay if we start a crowdfunding campaign for her bond? And he said, absolutely. And so we started it that night. And by the next morning we had already raised her bond money, which was $7,500. And the money just kept coming in.
What? That is an incredible amount of money.
I know. And that's like, we've paid bonds now. We've paid bonds as high as $40,000. They're insane amounts of money.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask, well, one of the questions I would like for you to answer in the future, and then my actual question, but one of the questions is what are the massive injustices that are happening to these people? Like, there's so many, but I would really like for you to unpack that. But my question actually is to help us with context a little bit with her in Guatemala. And I've been to Guatemala, and I've been to the northern parts of Guatemala, close to the Mexico border, where they're actually Mayan. So I would just really like to understand why she is in trouble? Like, why is she seeking asylum? Because I think for our listeners, they might need to understand that.
So in her particular case, she was from a really, really small community where one of her family members had become a sort of a liaison between the government and the community members. And this position ended up putting the entire family in jeopardy, because there were all sorts of sort of intense feelings about someone's right to have this position. And I think a lot of the hyper-local politics in Central America are often like this, where, political positions are positions of favor that are often kind of repaying favors, right? Or currying favor with somebody that you would like to sort of offer you access to something sort of bigger in the future. And so, not that that's unfamiliar here in the United States either. We just cover it up a little bit. But I think that this really put her her entire family in danger, and she decided that she wanted to leave before things became even more dangerous. Somebody had come to her home and sort of tried to like knock the door down and get in. And also she has 2 sons and 1 daughter. The oldest son was getting to the age where like gangs were starting to try to conscript him, which we see a lot with the moms that we support, particularly from Guatemala, that if they have teenage sons, they're really increasingly, with every year that passes, having to deal more and more with gang pressure to join a gang. And so she really decided that she wanted to try to flee before there was any violence. And it's really interesting, just as a very quick side note, that when she had her asylum hearing, the prosecutor for the government really seized on that issue. And he said, well, but you weren't actually a victim of violence. Like, nothing had happened to you yet. And, you know, one of the things that we have pushed back about as an organization in terms of a talking point and educational point is, why should somebody have to wait until they're a victim of violence, right, in order to seek asylum? If they feel that there is a threat of violence and it's a well-founded threat, then is that not reason? Like, if you're a parent, I'm a parent, I'm not gonna stick around until my kid actually gets hurt, right? Mm-hmm. I'm gonna go to protect them while I have a chance to do that.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so Julie, what is the, okay, so I watched the video on your website where it was kind of the story of 2 women, and it was really powerful. Like, I encourage all of our listeners to head on over to your website and check that out. We'll have links to in our show notes and all of that, but it does, I mean, kind of like with Ann was saying, you know, like, what do some of these people experience in the detention centers? Because it feels to me like there's trauma on top of trauma.
On top of trauma.
So by the time that you are engaging with them, like, you're just dealing with people who are a bundle of pain and suffering and like processing and PTSD and all this stuff. So I would love for you, to answer Ann's question, which is like, what are some of the situations that are in that some of these families are dealing with? And then also, like, what do you do, like, in terms of the emotional toll even that this has taken on so many people? Like, how do you address that part of it, which is so heavy?
So yeah, let's talk about the trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma. So as I was saying about the particular story of Jenny, she fled because of the threat of political violence and gang violence, which is something that we see is very common. The worries about sort of being conscripted into doing things that you don't want to do, right, or you don't want your family member to do, are really the primary reasons that people are fleeing in the first place. And in many cases, someone that they love or they themselves have already been a victim of violence. So you're dealing with that original trauma, right? Mm-hmm. Then you're talking about the traumas that are experienced on the journey itself. And so for families that we support, we've heard everything, you know, rape along the way, being kidnapped along the way, being beaten up along the way, just being subjected, I think, especially for women who are traveling with their children, to really difficult conditions. I mean, I often say, by way of sort of comparison, my kids are amazing and they're really great travelers, but I mean, get in a car with them for an hour, a car, right? Like, not walking thousands of miles, get in a car with them for an hour, and within 10 minutes, somebody's saying they need to pee, they're hungry, like, when are we gonna get there? Like, how do you deal with that as a mother for thousands of miles, often on foot, right? I mean, I can't even, there's that. And then there are the traumas, you know, I think there are so many traumas along the way, but another one is, you know, if you have paid someone to be your guide or your fixer, so to speak, there are often all sorts of, I'm thinking of the word in Spanish, not in English, all sorts of sort of tricks, right, along the way to extract more money from you. And so, or to like sort of leave you in a place and sort of like leave you stranded. And so they're sort of all of these traumas that you're dealing with along the way that you really have to tamp down and compartmentalize just in order to be able to keep going. And then there are things like, you know, we have a family that we support who, like, a lot of folks who are leaving with a child who may have a disability are then having to like carry the child on their back. You know, we have somebody who carried their nephew who has cerebral palsy like over 1,000 miles on his back. So you have all of these two sort of, you know, the original trauma, the journey trauma, and then you get to the border and you're thinking, I'm coming here because I'm seeking refuge and asylum, right? I've always been told about the American dream. I've been told this is a place of freedom and liberty and safety. And you get here and you're detained, which I think a lot of people know to expect. But then you're separated from your kids, which you absolutely didn't expect. But you're not just separated from them. You're forcibly separated from them in a way that there's no kind of transition. There's no kind of explanation for you or the child. And then, you know, your kids are taken to a place where most of the parents didn't know where their kids were or didn't have communication with them for weeks, while you're in a detention center, which is a prison. I mean, it is a prison in all senses of the word. You're issued a uniform. A lot of the women who were at Eloy, including Jenny, were given undergarments that were used and dirty.
Oh.
They were not given adequate hygiene products. You know, they were told even by guards who speak Spanish that they wouldn't speak to them in their language. So there are sort of these constant like attacks on your dignity and your humanity. And I think there are these sort of actually abusive and neglectful practices. And then there are practices that are psychologically harmful, like not telling, you know, a parent why they've been separated from a child or when they're going to see them again.
So what is your role at that point? Okay, so Julie, what you're doing is you're kind of like a mother, you're a friend, a mentor, you're navigating the system. There's Lang.
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Called a lock. Hang on 1 second. Hang on 1 second. Honey, go away. This happened. I have to lock my door.
Oh, my kids get a toothpick and open the door. So
All right.
Right. So, okay, I'm gonna start over that. Okay, so Julie, it feels to me like you are serving, then you have all this trauma that you're helping people with. So you're like a mother, you're a friend, you're a mentor, you're helping them navigate life in America, right? And language issues and all that. So what does your self-care look like, and your team's self-care look like when you are helping so many people who have suffered all this trauma?
Yeah, I always struggle with the self-care question. I don't think I've ever really been good at it, and I've never really been good at, and I was not when I was a social worker either. It's sort of like shutting the light off at 5 o'clock, right? I know a lot of therapists and social workers who are really good at that, and I was never good at it because I really had a hard time disconnecting and not thinking about my clients, right? Because their problems continued on the weekend. They continued between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. And so I do struggle with that. I would say though that the answer is my husband and I, like, we love to cook. We have, you know, we love to spend time with friends. That's been harder in the pandemic. But I think really like in the few moments that we have that are not IFT, sort of consumed by IFT, to really like lean as hard into our friendships and our hobbies as we do into IFT, right? So like there are times where I'd be like, maybe I should sleep 12 hours instead. But I think being with friends and cooking together and reading and being with my kids also, I mean, that's a huge thing that I feel like I could have a whole conversation about alone too, is sort of how this has impacted our kids, and sort of realizing that like I need to really sort of use my self-care time as a time to like self-care for the whole family, I think.
That's good. That's good. Can you tell us about Immigrant Families Together, about the organization, how you're structured, the role of volunteers in that as well?
Sure. So we started this whole process in late June of 2018. And again, it wasn't really with the intention of becoming an organization, and certainly not with the intention of becoming a nonprofit. But as I was saying earlier, I really absolutely underestimated the sort of the interest of people friends and perfect strangers in being a part of this, from the perspective of donors to the perspective of people who would just call me, find any way to get in touch with me, to say, like, how can I help? What can I do? And so, by December of 2018, we had already raised $1 million. And it was very clear to me as all of this money was funneling into my personal account, and my accountant was like, oh my God, this is like insane and problematic. I have to find some sort of mechanism to like account and like be transparent to donors. And I knew that process was going to involve becoming a nonprofit, but I was really sort of kicking and screaming against that because, like I said, I came from the world of nonprofits and I knew precisely what made them not work, right? So a really interesting side note is that very early on in our existence, really established nonprofit organizations and funders were calling me. I'm talking like 3 weeks into the life of this organization, right? And they're saying to me, how are you raising so much money so fast? Like, how are you being so effective? How are you getting women out so fast where all these other organizations that have been doing this for a much longer period of time are not as able to mobilize so quickly? And I said, they really thought there was some sort of like magic to all this, right? And I said, well, no, there's two answers. One is that it's the moment, right? Like, people were galvanized around this particular moment, and that cut across all political lines and ideologies. The second thing, though, and it was really the most important thing, was that we, as not being a nonprofit, we didn't have a board. We didn't have to go through a lot of the kinds of decision-making processes that you have to go through when you're a nonprofit, right? So our decisions were literally as simple as saying, what happened with Jenny was we got her out. Like I said, the money kept coming in. Jose, the attorney, kept getting requests from women who had been detained with Jenny, which is a great story all of its own. And he said, you're still getting money. Like, can you keep helping? And I'm like, well, clearly, I mean, I'm not going to keep this money. Like, it's not for me. And it just it kept going and going and going. And I said, the reason that we're able to do this is because our decision-making rubric is really this simple. It is, do we have the money to do it? Yes? Okay, let's do it. It wasn't like there were no sort of merit tests or worthiness tests or like eligibility criteria. Our sole criterion was, are you a parent separated from a child at the Mexico-US border because of this policy? If the answer to that was yes, then we were willing to pay your bond and get you back with your children and provide support for you to the extent that you needed it, for the extent of time that you needed it. And I think a lot of organizations don't and can't do that, right? The more formal you are, the more formally you have to behave. And I knew that, and that was really one of the reasons I didn't want to become a nonprofit. But by December of 2018, it became clear to me that we had to do that because there didn't seem to be any other sort of viable pathway available to us, at least that I had time to research, because I had no time to really look at, how are we going to be accountable to donors? But also, like I said, I had funders calling and saying, we want to give you $50,000, $100,000, but we can't do that if you're not a nonprofit. And we had looked into fiscal sponsorships, and in many ways it was as onerous as being a nonprofit. So I was like, well, if I'm going to, have all these same reporting requirements to you, I'm just going to, do that for myself. And so we filed for nonprofit status in December of 2018 and received it in February of 2020. And I would just say that, in terms of structure, we were an all volunteer, mostly mom powered organization that was very non-hierarchical, very shared leadership, very much, like most of us were strangers. We had not known each other, but very tight and trustworthy. And like, it was really a group of mainly women who, when somebody said, I'm going to do this, or can I go do this? They just went and got it done, right? And so I think one of the things that's been challenging for me, and I've also heard this from Shannon Watts of Moms Demand Action, is because our organizations actually started in a very similar way and have followed a similar trajectory, that when, we filed for nonprofit status, that suddenly was no longer a lot of fun for our volunteers, right? Because suddenly we had to follow all these rules. Our decision-making process did have to slow down a little bit. We did have to do things like have, a board that had officers, and they had specific roles and titles. And so that sort of not that flat, non-hierarchical model changed. And I think that definitely ushered in a lot of transitions for us as an organization.
So I just want to give a special shout out to all the moms out there who are just getting it done, which is amazing. So way to go. I feel like you have a whole organization of heroes, which is amazing. So my question, I guess, is like, have you been able to, I guess, reduce the traumas that they've experienced along the way? How have you been effective like that?
Yeah. So one of the things that was really important to me, based on my background in social work, and I think that really differentiates Immigrant Families Together from every other organization working in this space, is that we don't just post the bond and reunite the parent and the child. We also look at sort of the longer term, the entire process of seeking asylum, and ask the question, what is it that you need to be safe and stable and secure, and to, have the best life possible as you're pursuing asylum, right? Because folks who are pursuing asylum in this country, and particularly during the Trump administration, are put in this really strange catch-22 dilemma where they're told you cannot become a burden on society. And if you become a burden on society, that will affect your asylum claim. And yet you're not allowed to work, right? For a very long period of time. Of the 120 people for whom we've posted bond, I would say at this point, fewer than 10 have work permits. And it's not for lack of trying. And so how would you, negotiate that, right? Like, how do you not become a burden and not work? And then if you go into the underground economy and take an under the table job and you get caught, that also affects your asylum claim. So there's it's a no-win situation. So what really struck me, and I think my experience, particularly at Housing Works in my first job, had just such an enormous impact on me, because Housing Works really understood and modeled what it meant to provide holistic support for somebody, right? They understood that HIV or drug use or homelessness wasn't just about one thing. It was about all of these other things in your life. And if you didn't have all these other things, it was going to be really hard for you to manage your disease or manage your addiction, right? And so I thought, we really need to provide sort of this full-scale social support service, and also make it easy for people, because there are many organizations that provide maybe a piece of what somebody needs. So maybe one will provide some kind of housing support, one will provide maybe short-term food support. But if as a parent who's just arrived in New York City, or who's arrived in a town in the deep South where there's not public transportation and you don't have a car, you don't have the capacity yet to be able to go to 5 or 6 different social service agencies to get your needs met, especially when what is being offered is really short term, right? So I thought it really is, I think, an important part of our work to ensure that a family has really everything they need, including especially mental health services, to help begin processing that trauma. And so the families that we support are all over the United States, but here in New York, we have, until recently, we've had 6 families here. One just moved. But in New York, we've been really fortunate because we've developed partnerships with pediatricians, with schools, with healthcare providers, and mental health providers who have offered pro bono services. And that's been a huge part of the recovery process for a lot of the families here. And we try to, when somebody's in a jurisdiction where it's, where we have contacts or resources, we try to connect them so that they can have mental health counseling if they're interested in that.
Julie, do you have people who come to you to volunteer who say, okay, so I have experience in accounting, I would like to work with families with this, or I'm an educator, I'd like to help with tutoring, or do people generally come to you and just say, like, I want to help, put me wherever you need me?
Yeah, in the beginning, it was really, people showed up and said, I want to help, put me where you need me. Although a lot of people initially said, I've got a bed, like I live in, Nashville and I have a bed. So if you've got somebody coming through here, like feel free to get in touch with me. And we really did. I mean, for months maintained a spreadsheet where we just had by city or by town and just listed people and what it was they were offering. One person even got in touch with me and he said, I'm a pilot. I have a private plane. If you have to fly anybody within 6 hours of X location, feel free to call me. I mean, like crazy things that you just wouldn't even imagine that people offered, that have been incredible. And now much more so people tend to get in touch and say what you're saying, like, I have this certain skill. Could you connect me with somebody who could benefit from that? That's been a challenge though. Volunteer management has always been a challenge for us, which may sound strange as an all volunteer organization. But volunteer management has been a challenge because it's really, if you do it well, it's its own full-time job. And I think one of the things that happens is a volunteer gets in touch and they're extremely well-intentioned. And I think there are a lot of other things at play, like you don't necessarily realize as an extremely well-intentioned volunteer how traumatized somebody is. And so things like, volunteering to help and then sort of disappearing a month later, as has happened with a couple of people who said, oh, well, I want to teach English. And then we go through this whole process of getting them connected with somebody. And then like 3 weeks later, they're like, oh, I don't really have the time to do this anymore. I'm like, well, this person was just like really excited and invested in this and was like, they turned down an ESL class position because they were counting on you. And so there's a lot of like management pieces of volunteering that I think we don't talk about a lot because they're not so pleasant, but because it's really its own full-time job, a lot of times we encourage people to get involved in their own communities. I often say to people when they ask how they can get involved with us or how they can volunteer, I'll say, I'm so happy to have you at Immigrant Families Together, but also a huge part of our work is really looking in our own communities and saying, how can we start to dismantle these systems where we live, right? Because everything from mass incarceration to education to healthcare and access to healthcare, these are immigration issues too. And so in your own community, for example, is there an ICE detention center? And if there is, how can you help put on pressure to get that shut down? Or how can you go visit people who are detained there? I think really trying to draw these clear lines for people to making immigration relevant to them where they live is an important part of our work, and is its own form of volunteer management.
Yeah, I mean, I totally appreciate that. It's really, you're trying to really empower them to work locally, which is really, really terrific as well. I really appreciate what you're saying. It seems like what you're doing is really holistic. Like you're really trying to care for them mentally and physically and just financially, maybe even. Hopefully they can get jobs. So there's a couple of things that are sad to hear. I think like the level of the bond, the amount of money that is like also seems subjective. It could be 40,000, it could be 7,000, right?
Yep.
And then also the catch-22 that you mentioned about not having the ability to work and yet you need to eat. So how does that work? So I was just wondering if you have had an opportunity, I know you're a young organization, but to affect change on the system.
Yeah. So that's a really great question. Somebody said to me the other day, oh, you're really interested in micro change, which what I got. And I said, yeah, I am, because I know that that's where the actual impact is, right? I said, but I'm interested most in macro change, obviously, right? But the greatest impact is at the micro level. We have had an impact, and maybe surprisingly because of our youth, at a macro level, and in a couple of sort of really concrete examples that I can give you. Early on in the family separation drama, kids were often sent to foster care centers that they're for-profit, centers. And upon approval for release, there was a cluster of centers in Texas run by an organization called Southwest Key that had contracted a travel agency in Atlanta, Georgia, to fly kids back to wherever their parent was. And there was some we had like an inkling that there was profiteering involved. It was like really strange communications about paying for the kids' tickets, and then like the families, or we would get a call like really late at night and say like, you've got to send money via Western Union. It was like a ransom situation almost. It was very bizarre. And so we actually were able to document that there was the workers from this agency kept telling us that it was a law, that it was a rule, that kids had to be flown by this, company, that the ticket had to be booked through this company. And we were actually able to prove that that wasn't the case. And through some reporting that was done by Katie Vine at Texas Monthly, we were a source for that story. We were contacted by the Senate Finance Committee and asked if we could testify about that issue. And the Senate Finance Committee intervened. Within a week, the CEO of Southwest Key had stepped down, and a memo had been issued to all of the employees of the company saying, you absolutely cannot tell parents, guardians, caregivers, advocates that this is, a law or a rule or a policy. So, I mean, that's sort of one example. A much more recent example is we are supporting several women in the detention center and in other detention centers in the Deep South. That was the subject of the whistleblower allegations recently about women having hysterectomies without informed consent. And so that work that we've been doing and the work that we've helped do of connecting women to attorneys or connecting women to other advocates resulted in the Hispanic Congressional Caucus going to Irwin to do their own on-site visit and investigation. And that investigation actually continues. And so about a week ago, one of the women that we support, a week and a half ago, one of the women that we support at the detention center that was the center of those allegations testified before the Department of Justice and was released the next day because of her testimony. So I think, it's a lot of like pulling, bricks out of the superstructure. So it's still not quite as macro as I would like, but I think, we're always looking at, as we're really laser focused on the individual families and that sort of micro work, thinking about, okay, structurally, how are we trying to dismantle this system of oppression?
So Julie, what I love about this is that your mission, like you're grounded in your mission. Like this is the people that you serve, this is your North Star. But then the way that kind of plays itself out is, it sounds like that's more fluid, right? Like, okay, when we're set on these kind of lower level things, like how, those just work themselves out when we know. So as we close, would you just encourage people? I know that you've talked about, get involved in your local community, figure out, okay, what is going on there in terms of like the incarceration and the link between immigration and all these things. But talk to the person who maybe is still looking for kind of their North Star and their foundation. And what is it just time and reflection? Is it observing what you hear, like you heard in the news? Like what are some of the pieces that people can take and put together and say, oh yeah, this is where I want to be a hero maker in the world. This is where I want to kind of put my eggs in the basket. What would you say about that process?
So I actually am going to borrow some words from another advocate and writer who, on a book panel I moderated earlier this week, he offered something that I thought was so great. And he said, and it sounds maybe like a little bit silly, but I think that it's so practical and kind of so obvious. And he was saying, look, the border has been of increased interest to many of us for the past 4 years because Trump made it of interest, right? But as he leaves office, we hope, that will probably drop out of the news a bit. And so if that is an area that's of interest to you, put an alert in your phone for on a weekly basis or a monthly basis to sort of dig deep and figure out, okay, what is going on there? What are the current conditions at the border? What are the organizations that are currently doing work there, and what kind of help do they need? And I think, again, it doesn't have to be about immigration. I think a lot, because I have kids who are 11, 7, and 6, they're in public school. I think a lot about how our curriculum shapes everything, right? How our curriculum shapes our view of the world, our knowledge or lack thereof about other countries, sort of our own centrism as a country, and sort of like centering ourselves in the history, in the narrative of global history. And so I would love, this is not an area that sort of calls to me personally to do the work, but I often say that I really would love to see so many more people, and especially parents, get involved in curricular reform, because I think one of the reasons that immigration is so misunderstood in this country, and the reason that immigration often is such a hot button issue that arouses fear in many Americans, is simply because we lack a lot of information about what is happening elsewhere in the world, right? It's just not part of our curriculum growing up. And so, I mean, I said to my husband a few years ago that I learned nothing about Cuba except for maybe the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, in school. And he was astounded. He was offended. He was like, you never learned anything about Cuba? And I'm like, no. Or like 3/4 of the other countries in the world for that matter, which is so foreign to him, because there you grow up learning about like the entire world. So I think it's really about sort of what issue or area activates your interest and feels like it aligns well with your abilities, and then really start paying attention to it, right? Like pay attention to the media narratives around it, pay attention to the organizations in your community that are doing something about it, and then just sort of see like where is the alignment, right, between my interest and my skills and the need.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And I think that's just us being ongoing learners, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
I think that you kind of started this off by like you Googled the attorney.
Right.
And like the power that is on our fingertips, we all are without excuse, like in terms of learning more about our world, about the stories around us, about how we can be part of that bigger story of healing and of reconciliation and about these good things. So, we've talked about this before, Julie, but I just want to reiterate it here on the podcast that like we're at a time when the world needs all of us. Like we can't sit back and be passive observers, and we were all made with a purpose. And I think we just got to get to that work of living into that. So Julie, I want to thank you for this conversation. I also want to just push people to you. You have a new book that you wrote that came out in June called The Book of Rosie. You wanted to say a quick plug for that?
Sure. So this is the first memoir to be written by a parent who was separated from their children as a result of the zero tolerance policy. I am the co-author with Rosaida Pablo Cruz, who was the sixth mother for whom we posted bond. And she was separated from her two sons for 81 days. And the book it's published in English and Spanish. The Spanish version is El Libro de Rosy, and the audiobook has gotten really great reviews as well. The book, I think, is really great because it gives that full trajectory of a lot of the topics that we've talked about today. So why does somebody leave, right? What is that journey like? And then what are the traumas that are compounded once somebody's here? But we end on a note, I think, of a lot of hope, which is how do you build a life here, right? So once you've sort of transited all of those traumas, not gotten over them, certainly because that work is ongoing, how do you begin to build a life in a new country? And I think one of the things that she does really beautifully in the book is to really help reframe questions about immigration and to say, like, I don't want you to see me as somebody who's here to take something away from you. I want you to see me as somebody who's here to give something.
Yeah, perfect. So, and I encourage all of our listeners to head on over your website, immigrantfamilies together.com. And Julie, you have a lot of great resources on there. And it looks like people have done documentaries on some of these stories. And so there's a lot of good video resources there as well for people to check out. But yeah, I just want to thank you, Julie, for your great work. And you are a hero maker, and you are helping to develop the heroes that these women are, that they could be inspiration to other people who are in these situations. So just kudos, congratulations, well done. Like, we just really honor you and your work here. So thank you guys for listening to another episode of the Heromakers Podcast. I hope you guys loved it. If you do, give us a 5-star rating, help us share the word, and we'll see you guys next time.